Okay, so welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us for our first of our webinar series on clinical trials. In today's session, we're going to give an overview of clinical trials that we see coming up for GRID disorder, and particularly giving a general overview of what clinical trials are, how to participate, what to expect if your kid's in them, whether your kid will definitely get the drug or might get a placebo, and we'll cover all of that today. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the clinical trials that we have coming up this year. Dr. Jennifer Bain from Columbia is going to give a broad overview of what clinical trials are like in general. And then we have two families from other rare disorders who have participated in other clinical trials that will be giving an overview of their experiences and sharing firsthand. And so they'll be here as well as Dr. Bain and I, and we can try to answer any questions that you have as we move forward. So I'm going to start by just an overview of the three clinical trials that we are expecting for this year. So the first one is the one that you've probably heard the most about. So this is from GRIN Therapeutics, and the what's called investigational drug. It's not technically a drug unless it's approved by the FDA and other regulators, but their investigational drug is Radiprodil. And this is one that, as you can see in the third column, specifically targets the NMDA receptor. So this is one that we've talked a lot about, and they are looking for an indication that would be specifically for GRIN patients with gain of function. They have two different cohorts in that they've had so far in the trial, and we expect them to have when they launch their phase 3. So one group that is a reduction in countable motor seizures, and I think Dr. Bain is going to talk about what that is. And then another cohort that focuses where it's people who don't necessarily have seizures, and they're focusing on other symptoms. We expect that to be up to about age 18. And in addition to the sites that were part of the trial before, in Canada, Europe, and Australia, GRIN Therapeutics has said that they plan to launch into the US this phase 3 as well. And I think that there could be other locations as well. And we will share news, or they will share news when they have more to share. This clinical trial requires visits to actual clinics. I have this column just because the third one does not. So I'll talk about that when we get there. For all three of these trials, we would expect that one half of the patients would get the investigational drug, and the other half would get a placebo. So this is basically to measure to see if the drug is actually having an effect. You want half of your patients to be measured against people who are taking, let's call it a pretend drug. So you never know if your child is on the one drug or the other. But the good thing about participating in a clinical trial is that even in the first part of the study, the placebo-controlled part, where your child might be on a placebo, all of these trials we expect to have open label extensions, which means that if your child is not part of the trial, they can, if your child is on the placebo, they can get access to the drug after that first phase of the trial ends. And GRIN Therapeutics has said that it is hoping to launch in Q1 of 2025. The next two are two different biotech pharma companies that are having, I would say these two are quite similar in scope. So they're both focused on a reduction in countable motor seizures. They would both welcome any of our patients that meet the countable motor seizure criteria. So not just the GRINs, but GRIA, GRIK, and GRID as well. The big difference is where they target. So the Longboard is the company that brought this drug forward so far. They were just acquired by a big global pharma called Lundbeck, and together they're moving forward to the phase 3, and their investigational drug targets this serotonin receptor. The Praxis investigational drug targets sodium channels. So there's a lot of other sodium channel blockers. There's a lot of other anti-epilepsy drugs that are on the market already. Your kids may have tried some of them. I think that Praxis feels like this one will be more effective for people who have maybe tried other sodium channel blockers, and the epilepsy has not. It hasn't had the desired effect on the epilepsy, because I think it is more selective in terms of the types of sodium channels that it targets. The other big difference is that the Lundbeck Longboard trial has already launched. So they have a small number of sites that are already recruiting patients in Florida, Georgia, New Jersey, and Maryland. They also have sites listed on their trial website in sort of across the US, and sites in Australia where they are planning to recruit but haven't started the recruitment yet. So we expect those trials to be in the US and Australia, but we also expect them to be in other parts of the world as they move forward. And the other elements there I have explained. The age category is quite broad. We think for longboard it's 2 to 65, and we expect that the Praxis trial will be a similar age group. So they also have countable motor seizures as their focus. For the longboard trial, I listed there what because their trial's already launched, their inclusion criteria are people who have had 4 countable motor seizures a month over 3 months. In their previous trial, the earlier phase trial, Praxis had a different way of measuring it, so we'll see what exactly the criteria are for that study. But I would say that in general, perhaps most of our patients who have had these countable motor seizures would be eligible for both of these trials. The other big difference with the Praxis trial is they are planning to do it in a way that doesn't require clinic visits. So everything is done in the home. There's some visits to the home, but it's mostly done through, I think, online checkups and that kind of thing. So, I think some people say that one of the benefits of being part of a clinical trial is that they get really good healthcare in a hospital that they wouldn't necessarily have had before. So Praxis is still giving the option of patients that want to have clinic visits as part of their trial can do it, but it's not required, which may be interesting for some of the patients. So that's everything that I wanted to cover. So now we'll turn it over, unless there's any questions on this, we can turn it over to Dr. Bain.
Wonderful. I have now promoted Kimberly and Dr. Bain to a panelist, so you should be able to share. I think Kimberly. There we go.
Hello. All right. So my name is Jennifer Bain. I am a child neurologist. I work at Columbia University in New York City. I am a clinician, but I'm also a researcher. And so I see patients in clinic with neurodevelopmental disorders, including the GRIN disorders. And I also participate in a variety of clinical trials. And so today I am I'm going to be honest, this is the first time I'm giving this lecture, and it's with my co-host is Kimberly Berry. But I think it's really important for her to introduce herself and what her role is on the clinical trial as a lead clinical research coordinator, because they are very integral to clinical trials, in addition to the person who's the principal investigator or PI, that's me. So Kim, maybe you could say your name and what your role would be on a clinical trial.
Hi, I'm Kimberly. Essentially, I'm the study coordinator for the trial that I'm on. So I have most of the interactions with the family, and we do the day by day of like ECGs, vitals, communicating adverse events to the PI, aka Dr. Bain in this sense, who will then talk to the families. So we see a lot of families, which is why we don't draw blood on our kids, because then they'll hate us immediately.
So clinical research coordinators are really integral. I mean, the key for clinical trials is teamwork. You have to work together as a team, and you have to recognize everybody's roles so that they can be done efficiently and safely. And there's a lot of people on that team. So I'm going to thank Kim, who was able to put together a nice little slide of some of the things we wanted to talk about today. And then we can go from there and answer any other questions. Oh, but I have to actually do my share. Please feel free to ask any questions along the way. And then Kimberly knows a lot of the more nuanced questions, which is why I wanted her to be on here today. So we wanted to talk about just clinical trials in neurology, specifically pediatric neurology, but I know some of your trials are not necessarily in pediatrics. So what is a clinical trial? A clinical trial is a research study that's designed to test the effectiveness, the safety, and the side effects of new interventions, new treatments, or drugs in a human. And so there's different reasons why you would do a trial. And as you have heard about earlier, you have 3 different treatments or trials that are currently starting or ongoing for the GRIN disorder group. And I think it's important for people to understand what is the goal of each of these clinical trials. So we might do a clinical trial to start a new drug or to test a new device or a new procedure that might offer some benefit. Importantly, especially for anything that goes into a person, we need to make sure that we're looking for side effects or any potential risks associated with the treatment. If we watch TV at any time and we see a medication or a advertisement, you always hear about, please speak to your doctor if blah, 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 blah. All of that is the information that comes out of a clinical trial to really provide parents and families all the information they need to know about risks and benefits of a potential treatment. In the world of rare disease, unfortunately, there isn't necessarily a targeted treatment. So in GRIN disorders, there isn't a GRIN treatment. The point of doing these clinical trials is to say, are there potential treatments that could be more helpful than the standard of care, which in the standard of care for GRIN disorders are treatment of seizures, treatment of motor difficulties with physical therapy or occupational therapy or speech therapy. And so that's what we would consider standard of care for a GRIN disorder. And these would be specifically saying, if we give somebody an intervention, is it more helpful than just doing the standard of care? And obviously our goal in medicine and in science is to improve the way we live and to hopefully have better outcomes, and that can mean a variety of things, but our goal would be to improve patient care. There's different types of trials. So for example, an observational trial would be just looking at all the people that we have with GRIN disorders all over the world at all different ages. They're not necessarily receiving anything additional compared to standard of care. So people who get their therapies through school or with their doctors, or they're getting their treatment. The goal in these types of trials that we're talking about earlier that Keith was mentioning these would be interventional trials where you're adding on a specific treatment in order to see whether or not that is different than kind of what we would say the natural history or the natural course of that individual. There's different types of interventional trials. I think the 2 main ones that we kind of talk about here would be an open label trial, meaning we know what it is. I'm giving you medicine A, and we all know that. I am the provider, I'm the PI, the doctor knows, the parents know, the patient knows, everybody knows they're getting the medication, versus a placebo-controlled trial or a randomized controlled trial, where some people get the drug or the intervention and some people don't. Those really are much more strong studies. They're very, what we call the word rigorous, and they're really helpful to saying, yes, we actually think this is helpful. Why does it matter, right? So we all have family members who might take something and they say, oh, I took my vitamin C and my cold is gone away. And you're like, okay, well, was it the vitamin C or was it just like the 3 or 4 days that it took for you to get over the cold? I don't really know. And you know, there's a piece of bias in there. And so we need to really ask ourselves, is this really doing what we need it to do? In the field of autism, for example, there's what we call a placebo bias in up to 30 or even 50% of patients of any trial. That means 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 2 people say, I got better, and they didn't even take anything at all. And so why does that matter? Well, why would you give somebody something if it's giving you potential side effects and if it's also not really working? And so our job is really to say, how can we give somebody something that's safe and also efficacious and going to provide help? And so in these studies, as Heath had talked about, a lot of them are these placebo-controlled studies that roll over into an open label. So you'll get the medicine regardless, but at the beginning, you might not know whether you're getting the medicine or not. We can talk more about that later if that's helpful. That really gets down to the nuances of the specific study and what the design is. There's types of phases of clinical trials. So you might hear about like phases of clinical trials. And sometimes you can actually get very creative and like lump them together. So typically we would think of phase 1 as just kind of giving somebody the medicine and just making sure it's safe. Now in rare disease world, this is done in usually a group of people that we know probably have the disorder, but we're just making sure that it's safe. These typically are shorter in duration because again, we just want to make sure they're safe. Then a lot of times we'll kind of pair that with the next step, which is usually a little bit more larger group of people. And we're actually saying, okay, aside from the fact is it safe, but also is it actually doing something, right? Are we actually going to see changes? And these last a little bit longer because we need to have a little bit more time. And so oftentimes you'll put together a 1 and a 2 and say, I want to see if it's safe, but I also want to see if it's actually doing something. A phase 3 is really when we're talking about like the hardy studies, the good rigorous studies, where you're looking at a larger scale. Again, I know we're talking rare disorder here, but we're looking at more people, not just 2 or 1. We're looking at a whole lot of people, and we're looking at a longer amount of period. And really, these are the randomized control trials where you give maybe half get the placebo and half get the intervention, and then maybe later they all get it. But you're really trying to compare and being very thoughtful about the intervention so we can see if it's actually doing what we want. And then there are these phase 4 studies that are looking kind of later down the line to seeing if we can kind of expand that medication perhaps to another study group. So again, this is not necessarily comparing all these disorders, but just kind of giving you an idea of number 1, what is the difference between these different trials? Number 2, how long do they usually last? So again, placebo is a really important word because this is an inactive therapy, right? So it could look like a therapy, but we don't really know. We don't really think it's anything. It's not really intended to do anything. It's really to make sure that we're doing it reliably and that we're seeing it more reliably. We only really use that, however, importantly, when there's not really a treatment, right? It wouldn't be appropriate or ethical to say, I'm going to give you a placebo when I know there's actually a treatment out there, okay? I'll give you an example. Many decades ago, there was something called the Tuskegee experiment. And that was in a situation where they used a group of individuals, African-American individuals, who specifically were not treated for a disease that we knew we had the treatment for. It was, we're not going to treat syphilis, even though we know that penicillin will treat that. That's unethical. And with that came a lot of learning, things that we learned as a society and just as a structure to say like that was unethical, that was wrong, and we don't do that. So that would be a scenario where you can't give somebody a placebo when they needed an antibiotic. We know the antibiotic treats it, okay? But a placebo is really important to make sure this is really a reliable treatment. So we wanted to just start giving you guys some names because these are, there's a lot of word salad in clinical trial speak. I am a PI and I often have to look it up or ask Kimberly, what does that stand for? And so there's just lots of different players in clinical trials. So the sponsor would be the company, right? The company, the drug company, the foundation, whoever's running the clinical trial itself, they're considered the sponsor, okay? So GRIN Therapeutics, that's the sponsor, right? The principal investigator would be the person who's specifically doing their team. They're the ones doing the trial at that site. So I would be a PI or a principal investigator, okay? That may or may not be your clinical provider, your clinical doctor. And then there's a lot of people out there that are really trying to make sure that these things are being done safely, they're being done ethically, and it's different depending on what country you're in. And so in the United States, the main players are the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Locally, the Institutional Review Board or an ethics board. So Columbia University has its own ethics IRB board. and then the NIH as a whole as well. So there's lots of oversight from a lot of different people. Again, the whole goal of this is to make sure we're doing things ethically, safely, and in the best interest of every person. But really, you are the main player in the clinical trial. Like there would be no clinical trial without a patient, right? And so we need to work with families to really respect them and their role in these clinical trials. Again, these are more people that are out there to make sure that we're doing things safely and efficiently. So for example, at my institution, we have an Office for Human Subjects Protections. It actually looks at that IRB on top of the IRB. So it's even an additional layer of complexity. Then you have the NIH again, which really is looking at all research, the FDA. The CDC is probably looking at some of the work that you're doing. And then the CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, might actually be looking as well. So there's lots of other regulators involved. There are actual regulations in place based on history and what's happened in history to say these are things that we think as a humanity, as a society, need to be done correctly in the best interest of people. And so sometimes you'll hear these terms. So for example, the Title 21 Code of Federal Regulations or the Good Clinical Practice. So these are considered standards of practice across the world, especially in the United States, that we say these are appropriately done, appropriately approved rules that we should all be doing, right? Everybody should keep this paperwork at their clinical trial site. Everybody should make sure that they're doing X, Y, and Z. And it doesn't matter whether you're coming to my institution or an institution in California or in West Virginia, we should all be doing the same clinical practice, okay? And that's really, really important, and why you need to make sure you have lots of players so that we're doing things the same way in the best interest of this person. And this is something called the International Conference on Harmonization. We're all doing things the same. We're all writing things the same. So we all are speaking the same language, okay? In addition, HIPAA, that's a term that we use in the United States, where we're really trying to protect your information. And so while we need to share your information for a clinical trial, we also still want to respect you and your privacy. And so part of clinical trials has to be, how are we going to share your information to assure that we're providing you safety when it comes to your medical and your personal information? Now, I'm not going to go deep into this, but there are specific codes and laws out there in terms of, well, what is ethical, right? What is the ethical goal of clinical trials? And so I'll just give 3 of them here because they are really important, right? So on the bottom, for example, that Tuskegee study I had mentioned earlier, the Belmont report came out of that situation, and 3 fundamental principles came out. Number 1, we respect persons, like we respect every individual, and that doesn't matter. And actually, it's more important if they're minors, if they have intellectual disability, if they're pregnant, if they're prisoners. So all these special scenarios where we need to make sure that we're really protecting individuals. Beneficence, that we're doing things that could potentially benefit somebody, right? Not just me as the PI, but that we're doing it in their best interests. And that justice, right? That everybody has something fair, and that we're doing these things across all situations. And so this is something that definitely comes out in rare disease world, where we need to make sure that we're respecting individuals regardless of where they're from and what access they have. In addition, right, we have the top one here is the Nuremberg Code. That specifically is saying that in order for somebody to partake in a clinical trial or in any kind of clinical research, we need to make sure that that person agrees that they're taking part in this research and that they understand all of the consequences of that. And really, we're not coercing them to take part in this trial, and that this research is being done, again, in their best interest, not just for me. And so we do have a slide later on talking about what is informed consent and what does that mean. And there's lots of questions that we can talk about there. And then the last one is the Declaration of Helsinki. And this really kind of takes into part the fact that we often are talking about individuals who are not necessarily adults or legal adults, or maybe have the competence and intellectual capability of an adult. And so we need to make sure that we are respecting individuals, even younger individuals, by not only providing their consent from their guardian, but also potentially their assent as a younger individual. And so again, all of these are out here, unfortunately, because negative situations happen and we've learned from them. But the goal really is to make sure that we are providing safe, efficacious, and ethically sound recommendations for people. Okay. So we're going to go through like responsibilities of different people. So for example, the sponsor, again, so if there is a specific sponsor, the person in that, they are the one who play that critical role in kind of overseeing and probably funding the whole study. They do a lot, right? So they're the ones who actually fund the trial. They pay for the trial. They likely are the ones who design the trial, hopefully with people who know what the disorder is and what the intervention is. So they're the ones who are going to say, these are the objectives that we want to meet. This is how we're going to do that. We are going to define who is allowed to be in this trial, who's not supposed to be in this trial, and really just the overall structure of the trial. They also are going to make sure that when this trial is being done, that we're doing them according to all those regulatory guidelines, and we're adhering to all those good clinical practice recommendations. They also should be ensuring that there's safety involved, right? We are always supposed to minimize all risks to patients. They are assuring that we are doing everything legally in addition to ethically. With all those regulatory bodies, as I mentioned, there's lots of different people involved, not only the FDA and your local ethics committee. They're the ones collecting and analyzing and managing all the data from the trial, and they're making sure they're taking responsibility that it's accurate, reliable, and that it's also being handled in a way that it's protecting each individual. Again, remember, we're talking about HIPAA and making sure that, yes, we're collecting information from you as a research subject, but we're still respecting you as an individual. And then at the end of that, they actually are required and responsible for analyzing those results and reporting it back to those regulatory agencies, such as the FDA, who ultimately would either bring it to be approved or not approved. The PI, that would be me, right? So the principal investigator, they're the ones who at each one of the sites takes full responsibility for that trial. And so at that site, I would be the one, or whoever the PI is, be the one that's actually responsible. I need to make sure that we are following that clinical trial that the sponsor gave us very, very closely. My job is really to make sure that any person, and we don't use patient because they're not my patient, they're my study participant or study subject, that they are being safe and they're never being put in harm's way. We are responsible for ensuring that they understand everything that possibly is related to that trial before they go into it. And remember, I can't coerce them. Even more so, it might be really important if I am their doctor too, right? To make sure that I'm not coercing them into making any of those decisions. They need to know what all the alternatives are in that informed consent process. And it's a very active, dynamic conversation. It's not just I'm going to sign, like I'm signing a check and I'm going to deposit it. You really need to make sure that you're engaging and you're reading that entire consent and talking about it. We oversee all the recruitment and the enrollment at that specific location, and we're ultimately responsible for saying, yes, this is an appropriate person that should be put into this clinical trial, or no, I don't think they're necessarily the right person. We want trials to go well, right? We want to see medications that are effective and safe going to be approved. Therefore, I need to make sure that the people that we think are going to most likely benefit and show us that it's working is really important, right? And so that's a key part here. As much as I want to get the drug or the intervention to everybody safely and effectively, that might not mean that everybody's going to be getting it right at the beginning or at this stage of the game, okay? We are really responsible for everything, the study collection, the management, the analysis of all that data. We need to make sure that all those ethical standards and all those laws are being done correctly. And again, after everything happens, we really are usually the ones that are involved in the publishing of the papers and kind of looking at what the outcomes are. Now, remember I said there's lots of these regulatory bodies. So these regulatory bodies like the FDA, again, that's from the US, and then our local ethics board. I will say sometimes we choose not to say, I'm going to go to the Columbia IRB. I'm going to go to something called a central IRB, which is maybe just a different ethics board that's in a different location. That's a different question if we want to go into that. But basically, you're saying somebody that's watching me directly versus the FDA, which is looking at everything all together. And their job is to do, again, that regulatory oversight, making sure that trials are designed and conducted and reported appropriately. They're the ones that really determine whether a trial is safe, the way that it's being presented to them with all the data that they have. They're the ones who monitor all along the way to make sure that the trial is being done safely. The sponsor will continuously be coming back to each one of those sites and saying, hey, I want to make sure you're ready. Just in case the FDA comes knocking on your door, we need to make sure everything is ready to go. They are the ones who review all the data and ultimately decide yes or no, yay or nay about moving forward to FDA approval. And ultimately, their job is to make sure that we are protecting our public health and that we are bringing things out that are not only safe, but also effective. The IRB, on the other hand, is really, again, more locally looking at, they want to really make sure that since they're a little closer to the ground with my specific site, that they're really looking at the safety of participants at their clinical site. So while I am actually the one who is overseeing things, they're the ones kind of looking over me and making sure that I'm doing things safely. I'm not coercing my patients or my subjects, and that I'm really doing things safely on this medical campus. And so anything that's done on this campus or related to a clinical trial that's related to somebody on this campus, they're going to be looking over everything. Every single person that comes in contact with my clinical trial participants, whether that is people who are coming from shadowing in the hospital, they can't just come in and look at all of our clinical trial information. They're constantly looking at the trial here on the ground so that when the sponsor comes or when the FDA comes, they're ready and that they have the appropriate oversight. And they're really the ones that are looking very closely at that consent form to saying that that consent form has everything it needs to have in it to be clear and understandable so that the individuals and the families know exactly the risks and the benefits and the requirements of that trial before they agree to participate. So there's a lot of overlap, but it's meant to do that so that we're really protecting people. There is actually responsibilities of study teams. And so the family, so in this case, typically we're talking about a family, not only the subject or the participant or a family member, they themselves also have a lot of important responsibilities to ensure that, number one, that things are being done safely for them, and number two, that they actually are contributing to the larger success of the study. So again, this is really key, the informed consent. This is very, very, very important, right? Before anything happens, before I can even look at your urine, before I can look at your blood tests, before I can do a darn thing, you need to, or even your genetic report for that matter, you need to read it and say, I agree to even talk about this clinical trial, right? So you can't even start anything or talk to anybody related until you kind of start this informed consent process, because we want you to feel like you are providing your consent, but you are fully informed of every single thing that you potentially could be asked. Okay. The entire consent form could be, some places are two pages, 1 page. More likely, we're talking 30 pages. And in some locations, it's actually so long. There are some locations that are really trying to make sure that it's much closer, so you're not having to read through a 50-page document. You need to make sure that you understand all of that. So if you're not English speaking, if your other language is another language, is it converted? Is it translated appropriately to that language? And do you feel like you understand everything that's being stated? And after reviewing that, again, the purpose of the trial, every single thing that's involved, there's no surprises at all, the risks, your alternative choices, and the potential benefits, then you have to volunteer, you would sign it. You also need to know that you can agree to sign up, but you also have the choice at any given time to leave the clinical trial, and that is always something that that a subject has the right to do. And actually, once you hit 7 years old, the child, regardless of their intellectual quotient, they actually have to provide assent, meaning the parent, right, if they're younger than 18, has to write the consent, but a child who's 7 and up has to provide assent. Sometimes that's written out, sometimes that's just a verbal, okay? Importantly, the study participant and the family really need to understand that every single thing in that trial is very likely not really negotiable. While there are here and there changes, right? If you stick somebody and try to get their blood work and you tried 5 times and it's just not working, but really we're going to try our best, and we would ask families to try their best because we really want to get as much of those procedures done in the protocol as recommended. And that could be, number 1, just coming to the appointments. Number 2, making sure you have a caregiver at those appointments, right? Appointments have to be done in a certain window. So there's specific time windows that we ask people to come because we want to actually know at 2 weeks after taking an intervention, what happens, not 6 weeks for that person and 1 week for that person, right? So a lot of those things are really important. Are you going to be able to get to the study site within that amount of time period and have all the people that you need to be there? There might be specific dietary changes or lifestyle restrictions, right? We need to make sure that people can get the tests that we need to use for that test. And actually not following the protocol can affect not only the trial's results, potentially their safety. The majority of the work that's being done in a trial is really to make sure things are being done safely. And then really, this is a key one, reporting any changes in health. So any single thing that happens during the course of that clinical trial, from the day you sign that informed consent to the day that you are out of the trial, needs to be communicated with the study team. And typically that is the PI, but more likely it's somebody like Kimberly, who's the research coordinator, who is going to be your one-on-one person on the field to say, I got a rash today. And then we have to determine, is that rash related? Or no, the rash is because I was running outside and I fell and I scraped my knee and it had nothing to do. Unfortunately, every single thing needs to be reported. And then the FDA and the group has to say, yeah, I think that's related to the intervention or no. And having that really close communication, unfortunately, you can't be ghosting the team the whole time. You need to have a really close network. And so, unfortunately, that's a lot of work. Communicating clearly is very important. So unfortunately, again, we try to respect people's privacy, especially when it comes to personal information and HIPAA as well. But really knowing these things can be quite important to us as well. And so we do have the communication aspect of saying, yes, this is what's going on. And then also similarly, there is usually a confidentiality agreement. If you're participating in a clinical trial, it's very likely that that sponsor doesn't want you telling everybody, I took this drug on this day, and therefore I'm going to post it on social media. And maybe you can do that and maybe you can't. But very likely there's a rule or there's an agreement that you make as a participant in the study that says what you can and can't share about your participation. And that really will be depending on what trial you're in. And then importantly, it is important to know that you have the right, regardless of what trial this is or any clinical research, observational or interventional, you always have the right to withdraw from a study without facing any penalty. You don't lose your medical care, et cetera. So that's part of any clinical trial that you should know that right. They asked us to comment on why does it take so long for a clinical trial to actually happen, in addition to get approved. Number one, safety, right? If we started a trial and we only did it for 2 weeks, and then a year later, somebody started coming up with side effects, we wouldn't know that if we closed the trial in 6 months. And so therefore, we really want to make sure, especially when we're talking about precision therapeutics or maybe potentially gene therapies, and the brain, we really want to make sure that we're understanding side effects and potential long-term outcomes. And so that's something that we look at very closely, and the FDA is very aware of. There's some clinical trials that the FDA wants lifelong monitoring, and that's really important when it comes to potentially when would it get approved if we do need to monitor somebody for their whole life. Efficacy. Again, we need to show that it's not harmful, but then it might take a while for changes to actually happen, especially with behaviors. When we're talking about neurodevelopmental outcomes, we really need to know that changes don't happen overnight, right? You can't go on a diet and expect to lose 10 pounds just because you willed it away, right? It takes weeks, months, years for those changes to actually happen. Same thing happens with behaviors, right? And so if we're looking at behaviors as a potential outcome measure from a clinical trial, it might take a little bit of time to start seeing those changes. And so some trials might only be 12 weeks, some might be 2 years, because we're looking at different outcomes differently. That definitely comes up when it comes to seizures or not seizures, right? Seizures we count maybe a little bit differently than certain behaviors. In addition, right, the regulatory scrutiny. So the FDA really does need to make sure that it's looking at everything very, very closely, especially with rare diseases, because the question really is it the drug or the intervention, or is it the disease itself? And a lot of that, you need a lot of time and you need a lot of people to provide their feedback about what's going on. And so that back and forth communication can take quite a long time, as many people know. These are just important for you to recognize in terms of kind of, well, who pays for all this, right? So there's different terms, and it depends on what trial you're in and what their schedule is, right? So compensation, for example, say you are compensated. Every time you come to my office to do a clinical trial, you get $50. Or every time you come to do an overnight in the hospital, it's $100, right? You're getting paid, you're getting compensated for that time. That's a little different than reimbursement, right? I'll pay for your car to park across the street, and I'll pay for your airline to get over here. So they're a little bit different, but actually Columbia wants to know, and all the ethics boards want to know exactly, are you being compensated or are you being reimbursed? Are you being both, right? And so, because again, we don't want to coerce people to participate in these clinical trials. Importantly, for some people, if you actually get compensation for more than $600 in a year, you actually have to report it to the IRS. And that might make a difference for some people. So it is important to know all those little tiny things along the way. In general, most sponsored projects are not covered by insurance, and everything's covered by the sponsor, right? However, there are some investigator-initiated studies. I do a fair number of foundation-funded studies, and some of the expenses are actually billed towards insurance. And so that's another whole piece to all of this. Who's paying for all of this? Again, that's something that you always have the right to ask, and you should be asking, and should be clearly delineated before you sign anything. Importantly, even if your doctor ends up being a PI on a study, they have to keep those roles separate, okay? The goal of research is to advance medical knowledge. The goal of being a clinical provider is really to focus on that individual as their clinician, okay? Yes, they overlap, but they are distinctly different, okay? And so in a treatment protocol on a clinical trial, there's specific times and check-ins and protocols we have to do. But as a medical doctor, they're not necessarily aligning with those protocols. So importantly, depending on where you come in, you didn't know me before, and now I'm your PI, I might be checking in every single week or every single day. But if we shift out of the clinical trial and now I'm your medical doctor, that might not be a weekly check-in, right? And so recognizing the goals of a research engagement versus your clinical care are separate. And while it does seem like it makes sense to have everything at one place, that doesn't always work for everybody, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. It's very common for people with clinical providers in addition to having their research team. And so that happens regularly, and that's okay, and that's absolutely the world we live in. You just need to make sure you understand, what do I go to my clinical research team for, or my research team for, and what do I do to my clinical doctor for, and how do they talk, and making sure that they're able to communicate as well. Research activities should never take the place of the actual medical care. So if you have epilepsy because of your GRIN disorder, you should still be going to see your epileptologist or your neurologist. That study PA is not your clinical doctor, okay? There's lots of parts to the informed consent form. And again, this should not be a quick signature, right? You need to clearly understand, what is the name of the study? What is the treatment? What was the treatment's preclinical information, right? What were the animal studies that got us to this point? Where are the safety studies before we got to this point? I need to know exactly what we're studying, why we're studying it, how we're studying potential benefits, and every single step of the way. You need to know what your role is, what your expectations are, whether you have alternatives. Usually the alternative is you don't participate in the study. But you really need to understand everything, right? How long is the study going to last? How many visits am I going to need to go? Am I going to be compensated? Am I going to be reimbursed? Will my insurance, if I get hurt, will my insurance cover that, or will the sponsor cover that? Again, these are all discussions that kind of have to happen along the way. The Child Neurology Foundation is really helpful. They do have an online website. If you just Google clinical trials from Child Neurology Foundation, they do have information, and it actually goes down. And it kind of tries to guide families through the decision-making process, because it is really important to make sure that you feel like you have the people you can go to. And that might be your clinical doctor, or maybe you want somebody outside of that realm. I'm going to stop, and I'm going to thank Kim because she provided the majority of this data, and I'm open for any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bain. Okay, so if anybody has any questions related to what Dr. Bain and Kimberly have presented, you can put that in the Q&A, or alternatively, if you would like to raise your hand, you can use that function and we can allow you to unmute. However, if you want to go that route, then you'll be included in the recording. So make sure that you're okay with that before agreeing to do so. Okay. So we had a couple of questions, looks like in the Q&A, one of them, positive clinical trials for GRIN patients regarding function and cognition. There have been some early trials for L-serine. We have the early data from GRIN Therapeutics looking at function and seeing some improvements there related to behavior. And so these clinical trials are hoping to improve the three clinical trials that Keith presented on earlier. We'll see what the outcome related to those regarding function and seizure counts are moving forward. Let's see. I don't see any hands raised at the moment.
I did want to clarify one thing. I know Keith had asked specifically for me to comment. I don't know, Keith, if you want to pull up that slide you had where you had the 3 different columns with the 3 different trials, because I thought it would be make sure that like everything we talked about addressed what was in there, that second slide. Right? So here, right, for each one of these trials, on the top is your sponsor. The drug, it's telling you what the drug is, the goal of that trial, what they think the preclinical work is to say, like, why do I think this medication or this intervention is going to work? These would be your inclusion criteria, right? So who are the genes? Who are the people who have specific genetic symptoms or genetic disorders? How this is the inclusion, right? So you have to be included in this clinical trial. We might only want people who have a seizure, a motor seizure that I can see. That might be different than somebody who has non-seizure, right? So something that they're not able to see. And this might come back to what their clinical trial goals are. Again, these are your inclusion criteria. What are the ages that we're looking at? Where are we planning on going? Requirements of like where you're actually going. This would be something that the participant would be required to come to or not. Placebo controlled. So, right. So we want to know that, yes, we know that half of the people are going to get the medicine and half are going to get a placebo. But I know you had mentioned the open label extension. Everybody eventually will get the medication after. But at the beginning, we don't know who's going to get it or not. And the reason for that is that it's a much more rigorous clinical trial design. And then obviously when. I'm going to answer this one. Does participating in a clinical trial disqualify you from future clinical trials that might come out? It's a really good question, and unfortunately, we can't always answer that. It depends on what, it really comes down to the sponsor, right? The sponsor is the one to say, yes, you can participate in this. I don't think that what's happened in the past would have affected your likelihood to skew this specific trial. I'll give you an example. In Angelman syndrome, there are antisense oligonucleotides or ASO trials. So there were 3 of them, 1, 2, 3. And all 3, and 2 of the 3 are actually moving to phase 3. One of them is not moving to phase 3. And so all those people that were in that earlier study, they actually are not eligible for the other 2 one because they had already been exposed to the other medicine that they had gotten before. Obviously, I'm not the sponsor. I would propose that obviously those people, maybe if they did see benefit, you might not see the benefit if you put them into a trial later on. And so as crummy as it sounds, right? It's not good for the sponsor to include those people who might have already gotten some benefit from something before. Those people are going to have to wait until the FDA comes back and says, yes, we're going to clinically approve one of those drugs. But you're not going to really be able to tell until each sponsor kind of makes their comment.
Thank you, Dr. Bain. Okay, I see Narita has raised her hand. I'm going to allow Narita to talk. Narita, you can unmute yourself.
Okay. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
My question, and maybe this is the wrong forum or the wrong group to ask this, or maybe it is. GRIN 1, loss of function. I know you're all talking about countable seizures. Well, when it comes to someone who doesn't have countable seizures, where does that fall in? I know this particular, you're talking about countable seizures and doing clinical trials with that, but where are we going to be going with that? Someone who has loss of function, no countable seizures, where is that going?
Yeah, I'll start. That's a great question. One of the good things about the ion glutamate receptors, and especially the NMDA receptor, is that they are very targetable by small molecules. So there's lots of potential drugs that can either target them directly or indirectly. And so something like Radipradil, it targets it directly by kind of lowering the function of the receptor. But for a loss of function patient, you'd want something that targets it by increasing the function of the receptor. And there are at least 4 clinical trials that are either going on or about to start related to small molecules that target NMDA receptors that would actually boost the function of the receptor. But their focus is not currently on GRIN patients. It's on patients with schizophrenia in 2 cases. In another case, it's focused on respiratory issues related to colds. So there's other indications, and we at CureGRIN are actively meeting with those companies. And I think this is actually one of our most important things that we do, is to try to build the case for them to do what GRIN Therapeutics has done with Radipradil and actually launch a clinical trial specifically for our patients.
Might I ask the name of the company or companies?
Yes, although there's many that start with neuro something, and I don't want to get them wrong.
What I would say is, from my perspective, just make sure your voice is heard, right? So like they might be going with the low-hanging fruit, which might be motor seizures, right? But then making sure that the population of people who are not being met, their needs are not being met, is really important to say, no, there's more of us out here. We're not under that. So how can, like, let's make sure we're addressing your needs. And that's kind of where you have your team right here to say, like, we have a large group of people that are not being, their needs are not being met right now with these current medications or interventions or trials. What's next? And keep doing that.
Okay. So do you all recommend that people individually advocate for that, or just step back and hope that these pharmaceutical companies step up and do it?
So it's something, I mean, we're doing the advocacy on behalf of the GRID population right now. And, so we advocate to get trials in more countries and to focus on more than just epilepsy and all the things that matter to different patients. But there are definitely times where we want to call on our families to help us to make the case, as we've done, for example, with ICD-10 codes already.
Okay. All right. Thank you so very much. Thank
you.
Okay.
Fortunately, Kim and I have to go to a clinical trial meeting, but we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for having us, and great job to CureGRIN and all the GRIN groups out there. Please, show the world that you're strong and keep moving this forward.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Mike Tramfaglia, and he is or are we doing Renee first? Megan, I saw you.
Oh, I'm just adding them both as panelists.
You're adding them both. Okay.
That way they all have the option to unmute and to introduce themselves and share.
Perfect. So Dr. Mike Tramfaglia, he has spoken to our community, I think twice before, and received great feedback from our community on his talks. And so Mike is a medical doctor. He's also the chief scientific officer and chief medical officer of FRAXA, which works on treatments and cures for Fragile X patients. and also has a son with Fragile X who has been in a clinical trial. And so today is going to share his personal experience through that clinical trial.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, I wear a lot of hats, and so I would like to talk about clinical trials from a couple of different perspectives, primarily that of a family member and somebody who's actually been through the clinical trials process itself. Just a little bit of background. My wife and I started Fraxa Research Foundation in 1994, so we've been at this for a really long time. We started when our son was diagnosed, and that was when he was 3 years old, and our son is 35 years old now. And Fraxa, as an organization, has been involved in lots and lots of clinical trials over the years. We're still waiting for the one big hit, but we've had some successes and some disappointments. The first clinical trial that we participated in was actually in 2013. So this is nearly 12 years ago. And we were in the Novartis trial of mavoglurant. And that is a drug that works on a metabotropic glutamate receptor, mGluR5. So it's actually somewhat related to what you folks are doing. And the mGluR5 drug, mavoglurant, was something that showed great promise in animal models, although our testing methods at the time were a little bit primitive. It had also been tested in a number of other conditions and had been in clinical trials in a number of other conditions, including Parkinson's disease and anxiety disorders. And basically, the activity of the drug was just what we were looking for. So we signed up for this trial, which was at Boston Children's Hospital, and we live about 40 miles outside of Boston. So it was a bit of a hike for us to go to this thing. So this is one of the first issues you confront when you're signing up for a clinical trial is, what are we going to have to do to actually get to this place? And it's nice to hear that there may be some remote clinical trials in your field, and that's something that we're looking to do too. But to date, all of the trials in Fragile X have been at clinical trial sites, and they've been in major medical centers for the most part. A few suburban kind of commercial sites. There are these clinics that actually do clinical trials. For profit. They're not university hospitals, but most of the trial sites in Fragile X are big medical centers. And so you have to drive into the big medical center and you have to park in the parking garage. And if your child has Fragile X or autism or a lot of other autism spectrum disorders, like some of yours, it can be a little bit disconcerting because you go to this really busy place with lots of traffic and lots of people humming around. And then the first order of business is you have to park the car and basically cajole cajole the kid to actually go with you, which is a real challenge sometimes in Fragile X. So we went to the clinical trial site, and actually our son was, pretty well behaved. He was pretty nervous. He was pretty antsy about being in this trial. Didn't know any of these people. Had never been to this place before. And that's one of the things that you realize is a major issue in doing clinical trials is that it's really hard when you first start, but then it gets a lot easier. And in our son's case, it was difficult the first time, much less difficult the second time. Third, fourth, fifth times as we progressed and we go for follow-up visits, he actually got to really enjoy it. So if you think about it, we talk about placebo effects when we're doing clinical trials. In Fragile X, that's a big part of the placebo effect is that our son was actually getting to enjoy going to the clinical trial where it had been really difficult the first few times. And so that resulted in improvement that had nothing to do with the study drug at all. He just got a lot better along the way. But I think that's a valuable lesson for anybody who's thinking about participating in a clinical trial and maybe thinking, oh, I don't know if it's really worth the trouble. And what if we get placebo or what if we get a bad reaction to the drug? Just being in a clinical trial was really good for our son. He really had a great experience. It was really a kind of a growth experience for him. And one way to look at it is, the whole family's involved and we're all making this big effort and it's all for him. And it seemed like, at least on some level, he could really appreciate that. So clinical trials have a benefit, and it's not just what we think of as the placebo effect, that it's all in your head or anything like that. No, there are real things that you're doing that have really positive consequences. So we participated in this trial, and very much like the trials that you guys have been talking about, there was a placebo-controlled phase at the beginning, and then there was a continuation after the placebo-controlled trial was over. And that's a big incentive, obviously. If you're a parent, you think, well, first of all, I might get placebo, so I'll just be wasting my time and doing this all for nothing. But if there's a continuation, an open label continuation as part of the clinical trial, well, you have a huge incentive because then you can get this drug, which is, in this case, it was completely unlike anything that was available on the market. So what actually ended up happening in the trial? Well, we did the first 12-week placebo-controlled trial, and we didn't know what we were getting. We're just getting these very generic-looking capsules, and we're told to take one of these twice a day. And obviously, the company and the hospital pharmacy are stuffing them full of different amounts of the drug. In this case, there were 3 different dose levels. You could be on a low dose, a medium dose, or a high dose. And if you were on a medium or a high dose, it kind of got stepped up over the course of the trial. And we basically saw one very discrete step where our son had much better behavior and functioning on the drug. And it was really kind of impressive. But we were pretty sure that we were on the lowest dose just based on that. We just saw this one step. And that made us really look forward to the extension phase where we could be on whatever dose worked best. They could adjust it low, medium, or high. And so he did pretty well, but we thought after a few weeks that we saw it kind of wearing off. We thought, well, that's probably because he's on the low dose. So we got into they never tell you. There's a certain element of mystery. They never tell you what you were getting. Nobody ever knows. They don't break the blind. Although in this particular trial, they were authorized at the end of everything when the trial finally finished. They did tell us, and they confirmed that we were on the low dose, but we had to wait almost a year to find that out. So we go into the continuation phase, and our son had no problems tolerating the medication. We go and we start again on the low dose of the drug. Seems like what we were getting. That confirmed what we thought. Then he stepped up, worked even better, but he was still tolerating the drug really well, no real side effects. So we said, okay, let's go for the full dose. And so we went up to the full dose of the drug, the high dose, and he did fantastically well. He had a great response. One of the things that you see when you have somebody with an autism spectrum disorder is you get a lot of this cognitive rigidity where he has a hard time shifting to new activities. Well, a lot of that just melted away. We were able to go to restaurants and do things that we could really never do before. We had this really great effect from the drug and no real side effects to speak of. In fact, my thought the whole time was, geez, this may be the high dose, but he could probably tolerate a lot more than this. So I wonder if they got the dose right. And so we kept on that high dose for another 3 or 4 months, and we started to see that the effect was wearing off a little bit. So we were starting to get what seemed like some tolerance, and it was happening over a long period of time. It never completely went away. We still had a good effect on the drug. But eventually they broke the blind on they read out the results on the placebo-controlled part of the trial. And it turned out that the drug really did not do better than placebo. And so the company decided not to continue with the trials. And that meant that our continuation phase of the trial was going to be over and we had to stop the drug. And so we did that, and we actually had a little bit of a rebound, a kind of withdrawal effect where it was a little bit hairy for about a week or so when he had to stop the drug, and then he kind of went back to baseline, and he did okay. It wasn't really anything all that difficult. But that whole program ended with a negative result, and the company decided not to pursue the drug any further. And it was pretty clearly, at least in my mind, pretty clearly the result of tolerance to the study drug. And that's since been confirmed by a lot of other studies that we've done. But we went on and developed other treatments for Fragile X. And so more recently, this this drug was developed by a company in Michigan called Tetra Therapeutics, which has since been acquired by Shionogi, a large Japanese company. And so there's a phase 3 trial, which is still going on for a drug called zatolmilast. And it's actually sort of a smart drug. It's a phosphodiesterase inhibitor that might just increase anybody's intelligence, but in this case, we're using it for Fragile X, and we have specific evidence that it works really well for Fragile X. And our son was in the clinical trial for zatolmilast, and we did something similar where we had this placebo-controlled 12 weeks or so of the drug. And in our case, we're pretty sure that we got the placebo, and we saw no effect whatsoever. So that was a little bit disappointing, but it also had a continuation phase. And so then we went on the drug after the 12 weeks of the placebo-controlled trial. Open label, we knew we were getting the drug. And in this case, it's just a single dose. There's no high, medium, or low doses. It's just one dose for everybody. And so we started on the drug, and things went really well. And so little by little, we start to see our son's cognitive function improving pretty steadily, and it was really a very nice effect. Kind of subtle, kind of developed slowly, but it was really good. Unfortunately, after about 6 months, we ran into some problems with he just had a lot of GI problems, and he started throwing up a lot, and that can be one of the side effects of the medication. Although in the end, it turned out to really not be related to the drug, but he was just so sick that we just had to cut back on everything. So we had to drop out of the study, and that was a big disappointment. So we did it for a good 6 months or so, and it was a nice experience. Again, we had to drive. This time we had to drive to UMass, which is about 65 miles away. So we had to go a long way each time for the clinic visits. But it was definitely worth it, and our son did great with that. And by now, he's an expert at having his blood drawn and getting EKGs done, and he's just laughing and joking with all the nurses in the clinic there. And the only hard part, which turns out to be a little bit difficult for a lot of people, is he just had a hard time coming up with a urine sample every once in a while, and that ended up being kind of one of the things more people had trouble with than anything else. But other than that, he enjoyed the study, and he liked all the people, and everybody was very friendly, and it's a very positive experience all around. So I'd highly recommend it to all you parents. Be part of a clinical trial. It's good for you, it's good for the kids, good for everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Trimfaglia. And so our final speaker today is Renee Holmes and her son Carson. So they are from Arkansas. Renee is a nurse who is, I think, director of an autism center at the University of Arkansas. And Carson is celebrating his 22nd birthday today, or 22nd tomorrow. 22nd birthday tomorrow. So happy birthday, Carson, and thank
Happy
you so much
birthday.
for joining us.
Well, thank you all for having us. And I do work for the University of Arkansas. I work for the state's USAID, which is the University Center of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, which honestly came into play when I said, I think we need to do this trial, because we were a lot farther away than 65 miles from our research center. And so that made a big play into the fact that they were very supportive, and I was able to say, I think we need to do this. And they said, go get in the car and take him and do what you need to do. And so I know a lot of folks may not have that kind of work support and be able to just go like that, but it was really important to us. And so we've presented a time or two together and put together some slides just to show Carson's story and some of the things that we worked worked through over the years and some information on the clinical trial we were on. You ready?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can get my file. There we go. So there is Carson. Carson's story started back in 2003, and that is him shortly after he was born, and that was him last summer, actually. So that's where we started and where we are now. And I told somebody the other day, if I knew back then where we would be now, I don't know that I would have believed myself. But Carson was born a few weeks early. He had a ruptured umbilical cord at birth and was transferred to a higher level NICU and started seizing on his first day of life, and meds were started on the second day of life. So we started out pretty early, and he told us to hold on to our hats pretty quick. We didn't know his formal diagnosis, and it actually took us a very long time to get there. But this was Carson early on, and we started seizing early, and that was him a few weeks old. And I tell people all the time that was him telling us we better just hold on. But that was when he came home from the hospital. The road to our diagnosis was, like I said, was really long. His initial diagnoses were global developmental delay and hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. He had failure to thrive. We were diagnosed with an intestinal malrotation, and that was fixed. And we thought, okay, we're going to get better, and we're going to catch up, and all these things are going to happen. That didn't do what we thought it would. So, then was diagnosed with eosinophilic esophagitis because we just kept throwing up, and what we learned later is a lot of the vomiting we were having was related to seizures we were having. And so we kept working on that. Was diagnosed with autism later that year and was considered nonverbal until he was 19. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit more in a bit. But he would try to tell us a lot of things, and it just couldn't quite make it out. So that started on early. And then when he was about 3, the seizures just really started becoming more apparent. He had several different types of seizures. We tried lots and lots of seizure medication. Nothing ever gave us any true seizure control, even up until a couple years ago. We didn't have seizure control. And so we started genetic testing way back then and had this really neat geneticist that every time we would get something back that would say normal, he kept saying, but you need to come back. Someday we're going to get smarter. Someday we're going to get smarter. Keep going, keep going. And we did until he was about 10. And then I thought, gosh, we are doing so much, and we just need to take a break from something at this point. So our last genetic test was probably about 10 until we were 18, and we'll show that in a second. But we worked really hard, and we tried lots of things, and we really pushed for inclusion at school. Carson's visually impaired, but he can see straight ahead. And so we got to school, and he goes, I want to play a sport. And we said, okay. And so this was him at the state level archery tournament, and he did well. He could see straight ahead. We didn't have to pass the ball from somebody coming up from a side, but we could see straight ahead. So he liked doing those things. He loved going to school. We ended up moving to a different school in a different part of the state because we found something that would be a better fit for him, and it did well. But we just still kept seizing. We kept seizing. He had really cool friends who they communicated with he used his AAC to communicate with them, and they were just some really cool kids. We worked really hard for AAC coverage. That wasn't easy. It took a lot of arguing, a lot of paperwork, a lot of a lot of work on everybody's part to get there, but he did use an AAC up until, a couple of years ago. Oh, that's just him playing with it. That was when he first moved to an iPad based one, and he loved it. So that was a neat day there.
And that's the voice I chose was the Irish voice.
Yes, he likes to choose Irish voices. He would change it to an Irish voice. He would change it to Grogu every now and then.
You mean like Yoda?
Yoda, sorry.
Yeah.
So we would change that up some. It was kind of fun. But then we finally went back for genetic testing. We had this last hoorah, the pediatric neurologist, and she goes, you're going to lose y'all at 19. So we need to do one more round. And I said, okay, one more round. And we got it, and we found it. When they called after we got a diagnosis, it was an SCN2A. related disorder diagnosis. And the neurologist called and she goes, don't get online. That's going to scare you. So before she hung up the phone, I was online, and was Googling and trying to find things and trying to figure out what did this mean? I had no idea. I'd never heard of this diagnosis. But started finding things that made sense. And so all the 18 years, all the diagnoses we'd been given and listed and, put in a box, I kind of truly just literally would get paperwork and put it in a box, paperwork and put it in a box. All started making sense and it all lined up. Everything, gosh, all these little pieces started falling into place. And so we met with our genetic, had a geneticist locally that I worked with a lot at work, and I sent him this report and I said, hey, what do you think about this? And his answer back was, who is this? And I said, it's my kid. He goes, I need to see y'all tomorrow. And so we got in pretty quickly, and they determined it was a gain of function type, especially with the seizures that we had so early and so often and that were so hard to treat. So we actually kind of started having answers for the first time in his whole life, that things really just made sense. And so we took that diagnosis and we took the information we had and we signed up for the 2022 SCN2A conference. We knew nobody there. He and I went, I put him in the car and said, Carson, we're going on a road trip, get in the car. And so he and I traveled, we listened to lots of audiobooks and drove to, it was in Columbus, Ohio, I believe is where it was. And my whole goal was to find a trial. I needed to find a trial. We had this information for some reason then, and I knew I needed to find something that would help with the seizure control, with his quality of life. When all we did was seize and we were tired, and we would seize and we were tired. It was hard. And so I knew for him to have a better quality, we had to have some sort of seizure control. And so what was really interesting is we're at this conference. I know nobody there. He knows nobody. I'm sitting at a great big table by myself with Carson, and then there's another mom, and she's there with her little boy. And so we decided we're going to gang up together. I said, okay, we're going to sit together. And so one of us could at least go to the bathroom. One of us could go get food. And then this man sat down, and he came over. He said, do you care if I sit here? And I'm like, sure, have a seat. And so he sits down, and he's by himself. And then I realized there's like a line of people in line to talk to this guy. And so at this point, I'm kind of like leaning over trying to read his name tag. And Carson's like embarrassed that I'm doing this. But I lean over, find the guy's name, and I'm starting to Google this guy while we're sitting there. And I find out who he is. And the line finally makes its way down. And it's just the two moms and this guy at the table. And we start talking about, gosh, it was in the middle of COVID and how it was to fly and how's the weather and all that kind of thing. All the while I'm trying to go, the guy sitting next to me is the clinical director for Longboard Pharmaceuticals. And I need to talk to this man. And how am I going to keep him entertained to talk for just a little bit so we can get over to what are you doing? Why are you here? Because that's why I'm here. And we talked for a bit, and I said, what are y'all's plans? What are you gonna, what are you looking at first? I knew nothing about what their plans were. And he said, well, we've got this study. We're about to roll out with phase 1. I need adults. And they're, at that point, you had to be an adult to be in that trial because it was so early in the first phase. And he said, there's just not a whole lot to choose from. And I said, well, let me introduce you to Carson Holmes. He is 18 years old. And he said, here's my card and give me a call. And so that was on a Thursday. I started calling his office on Monday, and they got us plugged in with a research center, and they said, okay, here's your 2 choices. You're both, a long ways from both, but these are the 2 closest to you. Where do you want to go? And my choices were St. Louis or the beach. So we picked the beach. And so that's where we started going. And so, like I said, Carson's a good traveler. We were way farther than 65 miles. And we made our first trip down in August of 2022. We've made 25 trips from our house in Arkansas to Gulf Breeze, Florida. It's 1,084 miles each trip. So I've put an additional 27,000 miles on my car, but it's been very, very well worth it. We do data journal entries about 3 times a day of what kind of seizures we're having, if we're having any seizures, our meds, what time we took them, those kind of things. So we do a lot of entering in notebooks. We did 4 months in the first phase, and we did 12 months in the second phase, and we're in 13 months of that continued expanded access section now. And it was really kind of interesting whenever they were talking a minute ago, and we're talking about we weren't allowed to share anything about this study while we were in the placebo phases. We kind of had to lay low and not talk much. We couldn't put anything on social media, things like that. What was interesting, we could tell we could tell school we were in a trial, but we really couldn't tell them much else. And in the middle between phases 1 and 2, they wean you off of the medication or placebo that you were in phase 1 to increase again for phase 2. In case you were on placebo, they didn't want to just like automatically give you a big dose in the second phase. That's when we were 100% certain we got drug. We knew early on that we were seeing so much improvement that we were pretty certain we had drug, but I was afraid to say it out loud because I was afraid to jinx us. And so in that transition from phases, and they started decreasing the amount of drug we were getting to increase the second, and we ended up having to have an override of the protocol because we started having so many seizures. We had gone from having about 100 seizures a day, 40 to 100 most days that we actually sat and counted, to maybe one a week. And when we started weaning, it just came back. And so they let us go on back and kind of skip that long wean between the 2 phases. Carson is his own guardian. He has a supported decision-making plan. And so all that paperwork, all 45 pages of the forms Carson signed, we talked about all of them. The folks at the research center, we would go over every piece of paper. They would explain to him. He was allowed to ask questions. We did this each time that any paperwork was done. He signs his own. He is really good at it now. That is another one of those pieces that you gain out of a study. He is an expert form signer and paperwork reader. And they do all the lab work. He's good at getting lab drawn. He's good at getting IV started. He's good at getting EKGs. And then each time we go now, they give us drug to make it to the next visit. We go every quarter now, so it's not near as often. But that was our road trip. We and I are road trip experts at this point. We can make it down there in 2 stops. Got to get gas, got to get food. But this was the drug study that we were in. And this is one of those that I saw on one of your very first slides. Carson was in under the developmental epileptic encephalopathy group. And it was really neat to watch all this come through. But here's where we are today. There's Carson, his favorite boba tea drinking place. When we started, we had more seizures than they could count. When they would try to do his assessments in the research center, it was hard to get through one because every time they would look at his pupils and put a light in his eye, he would have a seizure. And so we slowly started seeing get better. Some of those provoked seizures, but gosh, the unprovoked ones got better pretty quick. We're now seeing 1 to 2 seizures a month, and the post-ictal phase is just so much better. I mean, he might have one, you can tell he's had one, but he does so much better afterwards. He sleeps through the night. The first few times in his whole life that he slept through the night scared me to death. I woke up that morning and realized he hadn't been up, and I can get through the house pretty dang quick. He's become more independent. He can stay home alone part of the day. He goes to work. He has a job at a local library, and his favorite thing to do is read. And so when we go to see the folks at like the Arkansas School of the Blind, that's what they go, but he can read. Watch, because he can read. He likes to go places out in the community. Tell him, what did you tell me when I told you I wouldn't take you? Who are you gonna call? Well, I came home from Little Rock, and he goes, I want you to take me to this arcade in Little Rock. And I said, no, I just got home. And he goes, well, I'll just call an Uber. And I said, oh, well, geez, maybe you will. We decided to call his sister. Target with sister was okay. So that, but he's wanting to do things. He calls me on the phone. He calls and talks to his friends. He tells us jokes. He understands jokes. Yes, he loves jokes. And he's pretty snarky and funny. But, what I always tell folks is these are the diagnoses we were given, but once we got a correct diagnosis and we learned about clinical trials, I, as a mom, got over my fear of clinical trials because it was scary. And I will tell you, I was scared as a mom. This is the best thing we ever did for him. So just asking those questions, this is what I tell people, ask questions, ask all the questions until you're sure they are sick of your questions, but ask the questions. Don't be afraid to look outside your circle for information and resources. And you are your child's biggest advocate. You get to ask the questions and you get to bug people because that's your job, is to ask those questions and to do it until you feel comfortable if that's the case, and you're their voice until they have their own. And at some point they'll tell you that he'll tell me he's going to call Uber if I'm not going to do it. But those things that I never ever thought would be something I would be having a conversation about, and that we're raising the next generation of advocates. That's my daughter. She's just right up there with us. She's a hot mess too, but they are fun. And give yourself grace. Nobody's gonna do every decision you have to make is hard some days, but you got to give yourself grace and know that you do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, you do better. I tell that to myself every single day. So y'all are always welcome to ask questions. One of the things that popped up in the box a bit ago was, what does it look like in your daily routine? It's additional medicine doses. It's additional data journal entries that I wouldn't be filling out if I wasn't doing this. But gosh, it's worth it because that quality of life piece is huge.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, he is. It's something we just never expected, honestly. Definitely not the outcome we thought when we started this journey, for sure.
Thank you both so much for your talks. Thank you, Renee, and Mike and Carson. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. I know we're a little over the time that we had scheduled the three of you for, but if you're able to stay a little bit longer, we'd love to see if there are questions from our community.
I don't see anything yet in the Q&A. If anybody has any questions, if you could put that in the Q&A. We could posit the same question to Dr. Tranfaglia about how clinical trials affected your daily routine and quality of life, since you guys have had some experience with that as well.
Oh yeah, we had I'd say a great improvement in our quality of life because both of the medications worked really well for us. Like I said, we did see a little bit of tolerance develop with the first one, the mGlu5 antagonist. Um, and that was unfortunate, but we never completely lost the effect. And with the zatolmilast, the smart drug, the latest and greatest, we definitely saw our son improving in all sorts of different ways, and we had people commenting on this all the time, and everybody around him was so excited about how well he was doing. And so that made a big difference. Participating in the actual trial, yeah, it can be a bit of a burden when you have to, drive, in our case, drive to Worcester, or in Renee's case, drive to a completely different part of the country. It was a lot of driving, but it was worth it, and it got to be fun. Our trips were fun. It sounds like you guys made it into a fun adventure, and that's what we tried to do too. We tried to go someplace nice for dinner afterwards or something like that, and we had quality family time together.
Yeah, if we usually we'll stay the night, either the night ahead or the night after, depending on if you leave our house at 3 o'clock in the morning, you pull in there in time for a 1 o'clock appointment. So sometimes we'll spend the night after, but most of the time we'll go the day before, spend the night, and go to the beach and I mean, how many times do you get to hang out at the beach with your 20-year-old? I mean, it's really been he doesn't think it's cool.
Yeah, I mean it's a positive experience all by itself.
It is. And just some of that, like you were saying, you're able to go out to eat and you're able to do these things. So as we're seeing skills and communication improve, we're able to use that in ways that we may not if we're just here at home. So, he probably could check himself into a hotel at this point. But to be able to go out to eat.
Take an Uber to the hotel and spend
Yeah.
the
To be able to go do those things that we just, you get in that routine at home where, gosh, I can go get carry out, but taking him out and going out to eat and ordering our food, that is a big skill. And
yeah.
to do that purposefully is important too.
One bit of advice I like to give to folks who are thinking about clinical trials is that you have to realize that your kids are going to have to get blood drawn, they're going to have EKGs, they're going to have to take pills. And a lot of people tell me, "Oh, well, my son can't take pills." Well, you better get used to it. You better get started, and you can always start preparing for that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm always amazed that there are some people in the Fragile X community, like a lot of the people in Europe, for example, they're not on any medications, and their kids have never had to get used to swallowing pills. And then a clinical trial comes along, and they want to be in the clinical trial, but they have to swallow a great big capsule twice a day. And you're not allowed to just break it open and put it in applesauce or anything like that. You have to be able to swallow the pill. That's one of the inclusion criteria. So people might want to think about that and think about things like getting used to having blood drawn or having an EKG done. These are the things that you have to do. And if you can't do them, you're not going to be in the trial.
One thing I'll just note is that there are trials where they will make a suspension out of the medication, and so at least one of the ones on our list, there's a suspension that's a possibility. So I know with the GRIA community, there definitely are people that kids that won't take pills. So that's an option
Yeah.
for some trials.
The longboard one is a suspension, and does it taste good? What does your liquid taste like? It smells good. I've never tasted it. Does it taste yucky or does it taste okay? It tastes okay. Does it taste kind of like a cough drop? Yeah.
Yeah.
You're the only one who's tried it on here. We have to ask you.
You're the expert, Carson.
But it smells like a cherry cough syrup kind of.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's been, and it had our biggest, I was thinking it was going to be a pill. So I get there, then it has to be cold, and they give you like 10 bottles, and you have to keep 10 bottles cold until you get them home. So just things like I had to go buy a cooler the first day. I wasn't really planning on buying a cooler the first day, and they reimbursed us for it. But some things that you just don't really think about. We haven't taken liquid medicine in, gosh, 15 years or so, and switched it back over to liquid for this.
Has Carson done okay with the blood tests? No problem. Our son, the first time he had to have his blood drawn, and this is a long, long time ago, we had to restrain him. We had to get like three people to hold him down so that they could draw the blood. And then it's kind of like I said about the clinical trial in general. The second time it wasn't quite as traumatic, but now he actually seems to enjoy it, which sounds crazy, but he actually
it's part of that routine. I think he just knows that that's part of that routine. Now, the first time it was interesting. And the second time was a little better. The third, it was, every time it got a little bit easier. And now he's just like, he's better than his big sister. He's good at it now. But yeah, that was a kicker a little bit. The EKG, the leads coming off, he's learned are a lot worse than the leads going on. And that was that was kind of a little bit of a hiccup in the middle of the trial, and picked up a Wolff Parkinson White syndrome diagnosis. So I was afraid they were going to make us stop the trial, but didn't. Though we saw cardiology locally, they sent us copies of the EKGs they had done, said, get him in as fast as you can. They saw us within a week here locally and said, yeah, he's got it, but gosh, I wouldn't stop. And so we've got local cardiology that we follow with now, and they don't know if it was something we just never knew beforehand and never had done EKGs on a kiddo with a heart that was doing okay compared to the rest sometimes. And so we just are following it, and we just follow up with cardiology locally and are just rocking and rolling with it. That was interesting. That was kind of that was my really, I'm sick at my stomach because I may have to stop. They may tell us we have to stop this drug, and they didn't. It was a lot of meetings and a lot of discussion and a lot of talk, but they let us stay on it.
Great. So maybe we just do a last call for questions. So you can click the raise hand, and then we will put you on camera. You can ask your question, or you can just put a question in the Q&A box at the bottom. But this is your chance. Oh, question just came in. Oh, just a thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been a wonderful experience, I think, for our community to actually hear from families that have gone through the clinical trial process that hasn't been available to many folks in our community thus far. And so we're excited this year to have the opportunity for 3 different clinical trials and have the opportunity for them to experience that themselves if that's something that they're interested in. And we're very grateful for Dr. Bain and for Kimberly providing all the valuable information about all that goes into a clinical trial that wasn't specific to the different sponsors that we're going to be hearing from over the next few weeks with the next upcoming webinars. Okay.
Yeah, so those just those haven't been scheduled yet. I think that GRIN Therapeutics maybe as soon as next month that we do that one. Longboard could be soon as well because they've launched. Praxis may be a bit later because they may wait till closer to their launch. But yeah. We'll share the information once we schedule it. So thanks for the presentations, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank y'all for having us.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.